Hi, I'm Elizabeth Schulze, the music director and conductor of the Maryland Symphony Orchestra, welcoming you to a prelude conversation prior to a live stream performance of a brand new symphony by Dr. James Lee III and a performance of Brahms' Second Symphony in D major. This is a concert that will happen at 3 o'clock on February 13th. I hope you'll be able to join us for this very exciting world premiere. And I welcome right now to our conversation the composer of the work, Dr. James Lee III, who wrote his second symphony, and he called it Aruka, or Arucha. It's a Hebrew word, and I just turn it over to you, Dr. Lee, to just tell us a bit about the meaning of the word, and then we'll discuss the symphony at length.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here. It's good to share my new symphony, Arucha. I have a long-standing interest in the Hebrew language, and this particular word in classical Hebrew or biblical Hebrew is a reference to healing and restoration. And as I was observing the events of 2020, I thought this might be quite a work that would be timely and for our listeners. So I would hope that we can all enjoy all of the wonderful sounds that the Maryland Symphony Orchestra will produce in this work.
Well, let me tell you, it is always daunting to take on a new work, especially the responsibility of giving a world premiere of a work of this length and this strength. I find it a magnificent piece of music. It takes on the form of a symphony, but I think it has extra connotation to it. And you just alluded to it. There's a journey through the symphony, and each movement has a title. And there is a kind of process a kind of spiritual process that takes us from affliction to healing at the very end, to triumph at the end. Now, this is a program that I can think of immediately, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or Mahler's First Symphony, any of those symphonies that take us from some moment of struggle to triumph at the end. It's not unusual for a symphony to take that kind of journey for the listener, but your spiritual life is imbued in this symphony, and the way that you make the orchestra sound in order to create these ideas is wonderful and unique, and it's been such a thrill to discover your language. Now, I have to say that we performed a movement of your first symphony last season when we were doing virtual concerts with our string section. And so we had a wonderful introduction to the music you write, especially that connection you have to your strong Christian faith, and also to how you are able to bring that into your work in ways that I think embrace the listener and take them with you into those realms of prayer and meditation, and also exaltation, as well as understanding the human dilemma, human affliction, human conflict. It's a wonderful, epic symphony that I'm just delighted in. I have to say, today I was working on the third movement, which is called Herbal Medicine, and the creation of organic beauty of nature is just spectacular, I have to say. And in your conversation that you had with our executive director, Jonathan Parrish, a few days ago, you mentioned your use of wind instruments and liking to hear them sort of bubble up as if from boiling water, certain things rise, gases or objects or whatever is boiling rise to the top and then descend again depending on temperatures and things like that. And I hear that so much throughout the symphony in the way that you treat the winds, but especially beautifully in the third movement as well, which just has this is, I think, in some ways the most amazing moment in the symphony, because something happens to actually begin that healing, which is spectacular. So let's go back to the first movement, however, because this is very typical American symphonic writing, isn't it? It has declaration, it has a big statement. By the second measure of the piece, we have the trumpets calling in a kind of fanfare-like figure that we will hear throughout, either quietly or as emphatically as at the very beginning as well. This, I think you said in your conversation, and I would refer everyone to the marvelous conversation that Dr. Lee had with our executive director, Jonathan Parrish. The link is below, so you'll be able to find that. You can learn so much more about Dr. Lee, his background, and also his compositional process. It's a remarkable journey you have taken as a composer, and now we're going to concentrate on the symphony for this, because I really want to take our listeners on this journey with you. And so I'm going to be asking you to explain as much as you can about what we can hold on to as an audience member to understand this journey that you're taking us on. So those first fanfare-like upward calls in the trumpets.
Yeah, so the upward calls in the trumpets, that idea of affliction, is really from another Hebrew word, which is ichabod, or ichabod, which means like inglorious, like the glory has departed. So thinking about this affliction, I actually used a text that was part of my inspiration, because I'm always having this great controversy theme, this theme that has gone back from antiquity in terms of this battle between good and evil, or light and darkness, and the affliction that was suffered because of coronavirus, COVID-19, and the various protests in the summer of 2020. I was also thinking about these aspects in that first movement when the trumpets have this really kind of dissonant, this call. It's an F sharp, C, and another F natural, which gives us this tritone, with this outlining kind of major seventh sound of dissonance. And it's kind of supposed to be intentionally kind of shocking and jarring to the listener to hear that. And then with that is added the aspects of the percussion, where the percussion are kind of exclamating or putting like a little more emphasis on that, along with the string. So that's how this work begins, in a very large sense of angst and instability.
And we have that one of the processes of writing a symphony. In fact, I wanted to ask you about this as a composer in the 21st century. The symphony is now a several hundred years old form that has taken on, it started out as very lighthearted background music. It wasn't even considered as important as opera music or other forms of music. Sort of started out as a three-part fast, slow, fast, contrasting piece of music, short, and then slowly through the 18th century it grew, and then in the 19th century it became sort of the ultimate orchestral utterance of profound statements, thanks to Beethoven and others. Of course, Haydn and Mozart and all of their peers were writing and strengthening that form. The idea of the first movement having most of the material that will be discussed throughout the rest of the symphony. That's one idea. There's an idea of sonata form in which major themes are developed musically and then even throughout the whole symphony, if not just in the first movement. The inner movements of a symphony usually traditionally have a slow movement that is reflective, meditative, heartfelt, or tragic. There's also usually a fast dance movement of some sort, a scherzo, a minuet, a waltz, all sorts of choices there. And then the finale usually refers back to the end of an opera, the happy ending, or a culmination of what's gone on before in some ways. If it's a tragic symphony, it ends, cataclysmically or something like that. So all of these sort of templates for the symphony have been played out a lot. And in the 20th century, there were a lot of composers who just didn't even bother with the form at all because, one, it was old-fashioned or traditional. Two, music and composition took a different form in terms of its harmonic use of the language. There was a lot more experimentation. And the symphony itself could be as short as 5 minutes. If you look at Leif Segerström's vast, I don't know how many hundreds of symphonies he's written, but hundreds of them. Some of them are as small as 5 minutes, and some of them are, just epic novels, shall we say. And also there's just people call something a symphony that we wouldn't necessarily wouldn't recognize it based on its 19th century form. How do you, as a composer in the 21st century, look at the symphony, and why did you use it and choose to write a symphony, which is a form that is sort of traditional, and in some ways the way that you use your themes and the fact that they recur throughout to remind the listener, especially that first affliction theme, the fanfare kind of call, we'll find it embedded in the other three movements. That is something that harkens back to, say, Beethoven, Schumann, Brahms, and others. So as a 21st century composer, how do you treat the symphonic form? Why does it still interest you? Because now you've written two, as far as I know, and you who knows, maybe a third is on the horizon.
Well, it's funny. Even the next week, I have a symphony for band that will be premiered in North Carolina. I've been writing mostly 10-minute or 15-minute orchestral works, and I wanted to explore writing something on a more of a larger scale. And I thought about the journey that the symphony has. And I thought about calling this Symphony Number 2, but I wanted to kind of take it away from that kind of, like we were talking about, this traditional idea, and give it this other title, the Aruja Symphony, like the Alpine Symphony or something like that. There's other works that are like the numbers are taken away. And I always think about symphony and concertos or concerti in 4 movements, because I always want to have this kind of heavier seriousness in the first movement, the lightheartedness in the second movement. But then I wanted to really work on aspects of beauty in the third movement. That's usually how I think about like the kind of beautiful aspects of humanity or of what we can see in this world. And then in the fourth movement, I actually struggled with the fourth movement and how I would end it, because I thought about many times when I read Revelation, it's so peaceful and beautiful that I thought about doing that almost like the second symphony the first symphony of Duthier, how he ends. This first symphony, it's very calm and peaceful in this D flat major chord. But in this piece, I was thinking also about the hallelujahs or the hosannas, the celebration, the finally never having to deal with affliction and sickness and illness anymore. So that's how I thought about treating the last movement. And I really wanted this journey to be such that calling it a symphony for me gave a little more, traditional seriousness than like a tone poem that one might think about, because it's more than just this kind of idea where you have the hero and how the heroic idea is being transformed throughout the various themes. Usually, as a 21st century composer, I might allude to some of these traditional forms like sonata form, but not really staying as tightly connected to that, especially in the first movement, because I want to produce these ideas, like present them, and then maybe some of them might disappear at some point, but then you hear them in the next movement or in the third movement or so. So you hear how it's been transformed, almost like the idea of what Liszt did in his B minor sonata, when he used thematic transformation.
Right.
And that theme, that's kind of that theme that appears in the left hand, is kind of dot 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 dot, like that kind of figure is transformed into something more beautiful later on, and then it just finally dies away. So that's something.
And also, you also use tempo changes, speed changes to give us a sense of the movement through. We call it the movement, but actually musical movement through that first movement space, and that allows a kind of contrast, and allows you to reflect upon different aspects of musical material that you've chosen. And I think if a listener is, I think it helps that you have given titles to the movements, although again, there's always this big question about whether you should let the music speak for itself or whether you really want to help with program. And I think in this way, I love the program. I think that audiences actually respond to having something to think about. Well, how is that responding to my idea of what affliction might be, or they're thinking about, wow, this is so interesting that this composer hears it this way, and what's happening now. It's a tool to enter in to understanding the music, and yet we can understand it certainly if we wanted. I remember that you said in your conversation with Mr. Parrish that you generate your melodies from the scales that you choose or the pitch class sets. The harmony. The harmonic underpinning, the keys or whatever it is that you've chosen. I found that very interesting, and I wondered whether or not there are melodies that you use that seem to be somewhat Middle Eastern in some ways, because you use a lot of grace notes. They're quick notes before the long note, as if it's someone is singing. In other words, our wind, especially wind solos, seem to have a kind of feeling of vocal inflection in the way that you've written for the solo instruments. And I was wondering if that was part of the harmony. Those fast notes are part of the harmony and you're just making them fast, or whether or not you are evoking a vocal melody, or are the two connected?
Well, I like the grace notes to kind of ornament the longer pitches that really would be part of the melody. But you're absolutely right. Those notes in the woodwinds, they are kind of imitating the human being singing. And I have been really interested in connections of American Indians and African Americans recently. So I've written two different pieces. One is a flute concerto, and another piece called American, which is influenced by that. And I have one more that I'm writing, an orchestra piece for next season for a different orchestra. And I'm using that kind of motivic idea because I know in my own family, I've always been hearing about American Indian in our family, and especially in that part of Missouri and Alabama. And that is something that I've been exploring. So when I think about like this kind of indigenous sound of people singing and expressing themselves in the various continents, that is how I've been expressing that, especially in the woodwind writing, where that kind of soulful sound of the natural voice of whomever is singing, but it has that kind of ornamentation with those great grace notes.
Has that influenced the harmonic language, the scales that you've chosen? Are you using modes to evoke that, or major keys, minor keys? I'm just curious about the actual musical material you've chosen.
Sure. Usually I like to use modes. I'm very fond of diatonic modes. And then I might alter them somewhat so that they are not as pure as you might as you might expect in terms of a Lydian mode or Phrygian mode.
Right. Yeah. I will just say to our listeners who might not be as savvy about modes as we are, we have two modes that major and minor, and those are the big keys that you'll hear in much of classical music, at least until the 20th century. But the modes are even more ancient and go all the way back to ancient Greece and maybe before that. And how I would characterize them is that they give different flavors because the relationship between the notes aren't necessarily in the same way that we expect for a major or a minor, where the third note is either raised or falls away to give a different kind of emotion. The modes have different relationships between notes. In other words, you might have a half step between the first and the second note. And what is that? I can't even remember anymore.
The Phrygian mode.
Phrygian mode.
Phrygian mode.
So da 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 da. It changes the flavor of the harmonic language because of the relationships in the scale from one note to the next. And that can really change the feeling that the music has. And I was just wondering if you were using Lydian or probably a number of different ones, but if you were thinking about this in modal ways, because certainly the melodies have modal turns to them, in other words, turns where the relationship between pitches are a surprising half step instead of a whole step, or vice versa. So I was just curious about that. And that can bring up a lot of relationships in terms of then the underlying harmonies. If you use modal language, again, the harmonies are not, typical da 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 or da da da. That underlying harmony might be quite different. You might have more fourths, ya ba ba instead, or something like that, going on underneath. And so I think when listeners are first introduced to a new composer, to their ears, they are encountering a brand new language. And so I want to give as much help and background to our listeners so that when they come to hear you, they understand, there is that affliction theme. And when we get to the second movement, which is a scherzo, we'll hear the flute come in, and the first three notes that the flute plays are the affliction theme, but it goes by so quickly that you wouldn't catch it unless you actually had a score in front of you and were reading music and say, those are the exact same pitches as what the trumpets had at the very beginning of the first movement. So it's very clever that you take those notes now and move it into something which you call alternate realities. And if you could explain a little bit, I love it that it's a scherzo movement, because scherzo usually means some kind of a sense of humor. So, or at least a joke. A scherzo means a joke in some ways. And I don't know whether either of those two meanings, kind of something fun or fast, yes. I don't know if you mean it to be a joke, but certainly the idea of clashing ideas brings up the opportunity for this kind of bubbling forth in a fast movement.
Yes, and alternate realities. That second movement, that is without being political. I don't know how often in the summer I would receive videos and all these different links that people would send me about the vaccine. So so many people were concerned about, would the vaccine be safe? Would it not be safe? And then hearing other things that's happening in politics and these kind of alternating ideas or these contrasting or polemical ideas. So I wanted to incorporate that and have this kind of incessantness about all of that occurs, especially in the first few measures. So you have the harp that's playing the same rhythm continually, and then when the harp is playing, then the violins start with these little two notes, da da da, and it's kind of like it's kind of playful, but at the same time, it's almost kind of irritating. There were so many ideas, you don't know what really to believe. Some are really outlandish, and then some of them you may think that there's some truth to it. But that's really based on my thinking or impressions in the summer of 2020 with all these ideas that were just constantly, I was being bombarded with on your WhatsApp and text messages, videos that were all
Sure.
unsolicited.
I'm sure our inboxes have been filled with such things as well,
Mhm.
or our Facebook pages with lots of links to everything. But the way you do it is just so clever because you take musical material from the first movement and then bring it musically into the second and use it to play on these ideas of and because the affliction mode is in the discussion, so then we know that there is a continuation from the first movement into the second, thematically, and but in a way, as you say, a little bit more playfully, and maybe in a way, in an irritated sense as well. And then you have a contrasting, if you could just talk about the contrast, as you know, a scherzo usually has one main dance, and then it's followed by a contrasting dance, and then the original dance returns. How did you treat this form?
Well, I thought about, I always want to have, as you said, some material that comes back because it's such a large work, something that a listener could be able to kind of grasp and to resonate with because they've been hearing it over time, but treat it in different ways throughout the particular composition. So the second movement, I always like to think about kind of these textural changes also. I like to have, sometimes, as you've seen in the score, this kind of overwhelmingly thick texture and this grandiose aspects. But then in this particular movement, after leaving that kind of irritating kind of passage, then write some of these little ostinati figures, this kind of like an ostinato, these figures that
A
continue
repeated
to repeat
pattern.
themselves,
Yeah.
and these repeated patterns. And then over that repeated pattern, having again some of the melodies and the woodwinds that are presenting themselves so that they can provide some kind of intimacy to what's happening, so that the ear is kind of drawn to maybe a trumpet solo here and there that is continuing to just change the whole character of the piece in this kind of like ternary setting before we actually go and hear the initial material, before that finally just ends.
So it's fascinating that, I mean, I find it interesting that, you know, human experience and human reality, something that's happening these days, can somehow be translated into a symphonic form of a scherzo trio movement, and still be absolutely understood for its program, but also understood on purely musical, you know, on a purely musical basis in terms of adhering to a traditional form. And that in that way, a listener can hold on to both the program, but also admire how you use the old form to talk about these alternative realities, shall we say. So it's wonderful. And then we move into the third movement called Herbal Medicine. And I'd like you to talk about that because, you know, it is it is a moment of transformation. And it is so beautiful. It is just, I just sort of want to sit in it for a while. It's going to take the listener into a place of meditation, in perhaps, or just of kind of a relaxation from the craziness of the second movement into a place of peace and transformation, and also a sense of a creation. It's the healing tree. If you could explain that a little bit more, it refers to a biblical passage, but also an actual organic being, creation that comes to life, and you can really hear, at least in my experience, just looking at the score, I can see the sort of the creation of the limbs, of the leaves.
Well, this third movement, herbal medicine, is inspired from Revelation 22, verse 2, and it's after all of this great controversy has ended, then humanity can once again partake of this tree of life that was in the Garden of Eden millennia ago. And I always want to see how I can work with music. Like, I love the orchestra. That is by far my most favorite medium for composition. And I always think about how I can transform or just take the listener in this other whole new sound world that is beautiful and that is evocative and that really can go into the soul of that person to long for something better than the troubles of our everyday life. And mankind was first allowed to eat of that tree, and then of course they chose another path in their allegiance at the time. So they were banned from that tree. So then all of these afflictions and all of these things happen, and then that idea of the alternating realities, these various ideologies. So then when we get to that third movement, I really thought about having these longer sustained lines in the strings, and then, as I had mentioned before, this kind of bubbling over in the woodwind, some of the clarinets and flutes especially. And as that continues, then you kind of have this kind of growing up, because mankind has been degenerate over years. So this kind of idea where you are partaking of this tree, you are enjoying your full health and peace, and eventually you would grow up into the stature that you once had, being like 15 feet tall or so. These giants of human beings, instead of being this kind of diseased state of from all of the exposure to whatever it is in the environment or in the lifestyle and the diet. So this particular tree that has these wonderful leaves that heal the nation, whether they are like physical healing or healing in relationships or healing among various ethnicities. That's all part of how I was inspired for this movie.
You can really hear, because slowly in a kind of scalar motion, in a scale-like motion, the strings slowly rise through the through the music, and you can sort of hear that happening, and then you can hear this bubbling up of wind instruments. Sometimes they have a beautiful melody, but often they're used as just a kind of wonderful new texture. And also, of course, the presence of the harp, which, no matter what piece, always lends true magic to. It's not that the harp hasn't been present in other movements, but in this one, it's very present, and you just know that you're taken into another world when you use that harp. Of course, it's a very ancient instrument. It's one of the original stringed instruments, right? We know that. David played the harp in this. But at any rate, it's just there is a sense of peace and of literally transformation in this movement. It's essential. You still hear occasionally there are quotations of the affliction theme, but they are kind of muted. It's not like it comes blasting at you, and they're kind of muted. You can sort of see or feel or hear a sense of something overwhelming, lessening their pain or their power in this movement. And then we move to Arucha, and this is the final movement. And you mentioned that you wondered whether it should end softly or, you want to. In this case, it ends in triumph, and I have to say that I think it ends in a bacchanal, and I don't mean it in any kind of sordid way, but it just in a glorious dance of, and the reason why I say that is because it has that mixed meter kind of feeling, and it to me reminds me of the music of Samuel Barber, the Medea's Dance of Vengeance and stuff, all that mixed meter and all of those things. There's a power to the orchestra that only the orchestra can do this, which is the power of the dance. And I know that the reference, it has nothing to do with revenge or any of those feelings. It's all triumphant. But the power of dance and the elemental God-given ability for our bodies to move in ritualistic ways and in ways that symbolize emotions is given such energy by an orchestra. There's no question when an orchestra goes into dance mode, there's hardly anything more powerful or more exhilarating than that. And so this piece ends with that kind of motion and that energy, and takes us, I think, in a wonderful way, in a delightful way, out of a beginning that was so fraught. In the end, it's just delight, and I think everyone will just sort of smile at the end and maybe even go, I can imagine light in people's eyes, the delight of receiving that final burst of energy from the orchestra. It's quite wonderful. And it begins differently. It begins, you think, oh, okay, this is going to be monumental again. It has declaratory aspects to it. We hear the affliction theme again, but it's different now, of course, because we've had the third movement. What I love about your symphony is, like all great works of this form, nothing has remained the same. Everything is transformed, and yet the material that you use is very minimal. You're using thematic material that you gave us at the very beginning, and now it's come back, but it's changed. And that's the part that's fascinating, because the second movement took it and made it into a wild, giddy, irritating dance, perhaps. And the third movement transformed it and kind of quelled it a little bit. And we arrive at the final God's reckoning, in a way, God's healing, where there is the sense of the affliction. It's not like it's gone, but the possibility for it to completely disappear is there as well. So I just have been enjoying this so much, learning the symphony. I know that our players are going to just love rehearsing and working with you when you come to rehearsal and help us with it. I know that we've had dialogue already through email with talking about certain passages and questions about them. I know that our players are eager to do their very best for you and do justice to your work. It is daunting to be the first performers, because we're laying it down, and there'll always be further performances that can hone and polish, but we want to do the best we can from the beginning, so that you really hear what you have written on the page come to life. So we're looking forward to making that happen for you when you come, and you'll be with us in rehearsal and performance when we start this marvelous sequence of learning the Aruja Symphony. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been just a pleasure working with your music and speaking with you today.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. I appreciate all of the hard work that I know you've already spent in learning the work and studying the score, and I'm really excited to be able to work with the orchestra and hear all of the wonderful procedures that will happen from movement to movement as we are bringing this work to life.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's nothing more daunting than giving a world premiere. There's such a responsibility to making sure that, at least for the first time, you get it right, and give as much as you can to the composer for them to hear and see how closely what they had in their head and what they put on the page matches the sounds that we create to make that symphony come alive. It's something that's very exhilarating, and at the same time, you're walking in a brand new language. You're walking in a world of ideas and imagery and sounds that are not always familiar. In the case of Dr. Lee's work, because we had some experience playing his music last season, there was a sense of familiarity, but the epic nature of this symphony is something that I was both astonished by and also felt a great responsibility to make sure that we would do everything we could to ensure that the listener really goes on the journey of transformation throughout. The other thing is that this is a symphony that is speaking of our time, and that's what's so incredible about music written for that we call from the classical tradition, because each and every piece was written in a time of a place and of a people, and it's almost like an aural snapshot. And here we are with a grand symphony, which can be analyzed and judged on its merits as in the symphonic form in traditional ways and musically, completely musically, but also is inspired by the events of the day, and so speaks to us directly about things we may still be experiencing. And that's an incredible. That's why bringing forth music of today is so important, because when we have our most wonderful and talented musical minds looking around the world and bringing ideas and aspects of our own existence into a kind of musical life that can carry on our being through the centuries, that's pretty exciting. I'm not sure that composers of the past knew that their great works would last, but I think that now composers of today have a sense of obligation to speak their understanding of reality, their truth, and know that it will last for a long time. And that kind of effort, the idea of making an effort in symphonic form, in such a vast form, an epic kind of form, a novel as opposed to a beautiful piece of poetry, but something that is that really takes you from one place and leaves you in another. That kind of responsibility and that kind of adventure is grandly taken on by composers of today who are brave enough to do so, as Dr. Lee is. So we move not only from something that is very daunting and a huge responsibility to another kind of thing that is very daunting and is a huge responsibility. And that is to play one of the monuments of music, the Second Symphony of Johannes Brahms. This piece, of course, is one of the canon symphonies in our repertoire. It is beloved by players and listeners alike. It was received immediately as a masterpiece. It was received with great pleasure by its listeners, and it was written by Brahms after he had already spent 20 years writing his first symphony. He wrote the second in a mere matter of 12 to 16 weeks. Can you imagine the relief he had at his success in his first symphony, and the joy and the ease with which the Second Symphony emerged. He was on vacation. This is when he would write in the summers. He was in the south of Austria at a lakeside, beautiful resort kind of area. And as he said, the melodies were so abundant in the area that you would just step on them. There were so many of them. I find that fascinating that he looked to nature for inspiration. He heard melodies in the sounds around him. This is something that we think of with Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral, where we have the scene by the brook, and we have sense of birds and bubbling water and sort of extra musical sound effects, although Beethoven never really goes into it very deeply. He keeps us elevated and keeps nature on an elevated form. And so too in this the Symphony No. 2 by Brahms, we have a sense of, it is pastoral in one way. I'm not sure that he thought of it that way, but it has taken on that because in contrast to the first kind of epic, heroic symphony, the first symphony which just is about struggle and release and triumph, the Second Symphony just starts out in such a beautiful, gentle waltz, and of course the popular dance of Austria, the waltz, and Viennese, and something that he was very capable of writing, although he was very jealous of Johann Strauss Jr. for the ease with which that marvelous composer was able to write dance music. If you listen to some of the Liebeslieder waltzes for four-hand piano and chorus, you can understand that Brahms was very much attached to the rhythms and music and popular music of his time as well, and quite capable of writing quite glorious waltzes. Here we have the beginning, a kind of mysterious waltz. It starts out quietly with a call in the horn. The rhythm is a waltz rhythm, a triple rhythm, very much like the 39th Symphony of Mozart, which we just played a few weeks ago. That sense of a dance, a slow, a quiet dance. So too does this begin. There is a sense of wonder, a sense of ease, but also a little bit of mystery as well. We called our concert Heaven and Earth for a reason. One reason was the Arucha, of course, refers to has a biblical sense and has a sense of a power from beyond affecting mankind's existence and bringing peace and healing to mankind's existence. In the Brahms symphony, there is a sense of otherworldly, but that other world is kind of nature and its effect on a human being. And that human being is Brahms himself. There is, in the 19th century, which is eventually epitomized in the music of Mahler. At the end of the century, we have Beethoven, his personality is imbued throughout all of his symphonies. We have a sense of Beethoven and his struggling. And by Brahms, we have a sense of someone who has taken on the mantle of Beethoven, but also it brings in all of his experience, first as a young accompanist of a gypsy violinist early on in his life. We'll hear some gypsy music later on in the last movement. We have all of who Brahms is, he puts into his symphonies. So he's on vacation, and we have a sense of someone who is encountering nature in a more relaxed sense, but also a very attentive sense. The first movement starts out with just 3 notes of descending pitch that descends one step and then comes back up to the original pitch. And that is said in the basses. And then we have a beautiful upward moving line in the horn, kind of a horn call of some sort. But these 3 notes that we hear, just like as in a Beethoven symphony, these 3 notes are going to be given the transformation. Very much like the Arucha symphony has a transformation from those notes of affliction that we spoke of earlier. These 3 notes are going to be spun out either quickly, mysteriously, hidden in some way, in very augmented form, so that it's going by very slowly in a harmonic underpinning, or very, very quickly, as in the very last movement. If you hear the first 3 notes of the violins, those are those first 3 notes that we hear in a slow passage at the very beginning of the first movement. It's been transformed into something that is now going to take flight in the last movement. First movement pours out in a sonata form, first theme, second theme, a second theme that is just glorious and romantic. Some people have likened it to Brahms's famous lullaby. It's played in the lower strings and has a beautiful, again, a kind of waltz, a lilt to it. But he is a master of the low range in the string instruments. Whenever he gives something to the violas to play, we know something very special is going to happen, and indeed it does. So whereas the first theme, it kind of cascades down, the second theme kind of rocks us and gently moves us in a beautiful dance. And then all of that is played out in a development, a recapitulation that kind of comes upon us organically, as opposed to a full stop and then a repeat of original. It's sort of very much like Brahms. He loves to dovetail. He loves to bring you into a return, a recapitulation, in the form, without you even knowing we've arrived at, we are at the beginning again. But again, by the time Brahms is writing music, and really always before, a repeat should never, ever be the same, because we have gone through a process in music, listening, experiencing, so that when we return to music that we have heard before, it cannot ever be exactly the same, even if it's note by note. It's the experience of how we got back to that place, that journey in between, the development. With excellent composers, that is what makes a return to original music so special and so important, because something has happened that makes us understand the beginning a little bit more deeply, or changes our whole attitude toward what it sounded like at the beginning. Second movement has a bit of shadow to it. Everyone thinks of this symphony as all delightful and not so much cheery. Brahms was never really a cheery person. He had a very wicked sense of humor. He was a bit of a cynic, a little bit, and he was very much a critic of his own music. I had no idea that he had written 30 string quartets, but only allowed just a few to come to publication. He threw the rest out. Can you even imagine the wealth of music that he threw out because he didn't think it was good enough? My goodness, he was just very hard on himself. So every note counted in every symphony or piece of music that he ever wrote, whether it was a lighthearted song or a big symphony or his German Requiem. Every note was considered and reconsidered many, many times. I will say one thing, the last movement ends very lightheartedly. It refers to a song that he was writing at the time. The English translation of the title is "Love is so lovely in springtime." And even if you hear the melody, you can actually hear Lieb ist so lieblich in Frühling, love is so lovely in springtime. That rhythm actually is right there in the closing flute melody. And I think it's an indication of where Brahms was as a composer and what was going on. He's bringing in compositions that he's writing at the same time. He's bringing in everything that is affecting him, and everything counts in terms of the material that he can use. And it also gives us a sense of a lift out of the first movement in a lighthearted way, which brings us to the second movement, which I said before has a bit of some shadow or some cloud to it. It's an adagio. It's not an andante. It's not easygoing. It really does call for the listener to really pay attention. Pay attention to the organic transformations of one theme that is kind of scalar going up against a descending theme that goes down in the lower strings. So it is this yearning or aspiring, going upward theme that is contrasted by this other kind of passionate evocation, declaration in the cellos at the very beginning. And we have this played out throughout the second movement. There are a lot of I wouldn't call them variation in themes, but there's a lot of development of the musical material. Again, this step. This back and forth moving between one pitch and the other, the half step is played out also in some of the melodic material of this movement that refers back to the opening three notes, pitch lower, and then up again to the original pitch that we hear in the first movement. We hear that played out now in a different way, going up and coming down. And that is, and then after that second movement, which is passionate, a little bit of meditation, a little bit of this contrasting, of kind of trying to pull into light and coming back into shadow, which only Brahms can do so well. I think it was part of his personality. Even as he smiled, there was always something going on that would keep him from enjoying himself completely. And indeed, he was writing a piece of music. It was a sacred motet, asking God, why have you forsaken me, kind of. And so that also was affecting the music that he was writing, perhaps in this movement a little bit too. And he does say that to a friend in a letter. So we know that he did have some of that angst or questioning in mind when he wrote this second movement. And then the third movement changes this completely. It's almost for a tiny chamber orchestra. We don't have the lower brass. It's just for a small ensemble, and it's a short little dance movement. The melody starts the first three notes of that is sort of an inversion. It goes up and down as opposed to down. Pitch lower and then pitch up. This time it comes up and comes down. It's very simple, done, and it's a little scherzo trio, a kind of rustic waltz, very countryside, perhaps an evocation of what he was hearing on vacation in the little town in South Austria by a lake. It also goes back to earlier works for orchestra, his serenades. Some people have likened it more to a Baroque suite of dances because it has some variation. It has two trio, in other words, two contrasting dances based on the first original dance, but they each get faster and faster and use shorter and shorter notes to play the melody. So it's almost like a variation in some ways. And in some ways, it does have more contrasting dances than a traditional scherzo contrasting dance followed by the original scherzo again. So it's just a delight. It's just an intimate miniature, very much the way Tchaikovsky would write these wonderful characteristic miniatures in his grand symphonies, where the outlying movements would be just so gargantuan, and then you would have these marvelous mini virtuosic moments for the orchestra that just give us a chance to step back and just purely enjoy the music. And that's what this third movement does in Brahms' Second Symphony. And finally, at the very end, this is a magnificent movement. It's one of the most fun. There are moments of pure silence and then gotcha moments. It evidently received standing ovation at its first performance, and no question that people were absolutely astounded by the fun in it, the exclamation points all over this last movement. It starts out again using those first three notes that we hear at the beginning of it, but then it just moves on into this kind of snake-like fun pattern of melody that just, there's a kind of hide-and-seek quality to it. There's someone's waiting behind the curtain to surprise you. And indeed it does. It just breaks forth into this just glorious and celebratory music. Again, this is the kind of music that most musicians love to play. It's familiar, but also it lies well in the hand or in the breath. There is something very connected to actually making music in the music of Brahms. You know that he is a player. You know that he is a chamber musician. You know that his experience and his friendships with other instrumentalists have made making music, the physical aspect of making music, part of his concept of composing. I always liken the music of Brahms to breathing. There is a sense of of someone literally physically taking air in and expending making a statement. It isn't foursquare, it isn't regular, it isn't an automatic breathing machine. It is the way humans breathe as they speak. That phrases last as long as they must last. If it's a 5-bar phrase, it's a 5-bar phrase. If it's a 2-bar phrase, it's because it needs to be a 2-bar phrase. He learned this from Mozart, who was never regular, even though Mozart's music sounds perfectly balanced. If you really look at the phrasing structure, you realize that he's playing with it all the time. And Brahms took this lesson from Mozart. A phrase lasts as long as it must. It must be inevitable, and it must feel right physically. And indeed, the music of Brahms always has this sense of being right, this care that he took in putting together this, what seems like a very easy symphony. When you look at it, you look at the counterpoint, you look at the fugal writing, you realize that he is bringing all of his vast ability as a composer and also his understanding of tradition into the writing of a piece, but somehow through the miracle of his great talent and his understanding of human nature and of nature surrounding and the inspiration of nature, he is able to turn that into a magnificent work of music that, again, takes us on a journey with the man Brahms in one of his most happy times.